Robbie Rhodes from 90.7 WXIN here with Dr. Jill Stein. I want to thank you for joining us here today, Jill.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Robbie.
Okay, so a recent wave of your new younger supporters are a lot of disenfranchised Bernie Sanders supporters. In what ways would you think your platform compares to Bernie's, and in what ways would you say it differs?
So our platforms are very similar in that we want an economy that works for working people, that works for young people and elders, and that gives us a future with the climate, with health care as a human right, with affordable higher education. We've both called for making public higher education free. We call for workers' rights and for a $15 an hour minimum wage as a national standard. So we have a lot of similarities. We differ, I think, in that I call for ending student debt because we bailed out the crooks on Wall Street who crashed the economy. We think it's time to bail out the victims of that crashed economy because the jobs out there now, that have come back are low wage, part-time, temporary jobs, not what you need in order to pay back that debt, not what you need in order to have a decent future. Mm-hmm. So we say Wall Street already tore up the contract when they crashed the economy with predatory lending and unethical bundling and peddling of those insecure investment instruments. So we go a little bit farther than Bernie on in ending student debt. Also in calling for an end to the privatization of our public schools. We oppose high-stakes testing, actually, in secondary school, and the use of those tests to basically take over poor schools, to declare them, dysfunctional, and to privatize them and to charterize them. We oppose that and call for the full funding of public education and addressing poverty actually as the biggest threat to educating our students, the biggest hurdle. Another difference, a big difference, is in foreign policy, where we call for a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, and ending these regime change wars, these catastrophic wars on terror that have actually just created more cycles of terror, and which is bankrupting our budget. We pay more than half of our discretionary budget for these wars that are making us less secure rather than more secure. We call for putting those dollars into true security here at home. So those are, I think, the major differences. But let me say, I think the biggest difference is that what we learned in the Sanders campaign was that you can't have a revolutionary campaign in a counter-revolutionary party, given the way the Democratic Party sabotaged the Sanders campaign, as we saw in the emails. So we're continuing to build that movement outside of a counter-revolutionary party, inside of the Green Party, which now many people say it's burning green because of all the Bernie people that have come into the Green Party. So we're working together stronger than ever.
Great. So speaking of the Democratic Party, in a Politico podcast, you recently referred to Hillary Clinton as a bigger threat than Donald Trump. As someone whose ideals lean more towards liberalism than conservatism, how can you back up this claim?
So I think that's taken out of context.
Oh, okay.
I think what I said was that some people consider her the bigger threat. Well, actually not the bigger threat, but possibly the more effective threat. Just in that she's likely to have a cooperative Congress, and from the looks of things now, if Trump were to win, he's not likely to have a cooperative Congress. But, we don't know for sure. And I think, a lot of politics is, sort of warmed over speculation. And the bottom line, in my view, is that we should not be forced to choose between, a fearmonger and a hate monger who says despicable things, and a politician who really represents business as usual, who's taken us into outrageous wars, who's not been banning immigrants or banning Muslims, but she's been bombing Muslims. Is that better? I don't think so. Who's taken us into the most catastrophic wars, really, arguably, ever, if you look at the results of Libya. So Donald Trump is a walking disaster, but Hillary Clinton is a lot to be afraid of as well, The bottom line is we live in a democracy. We have more than two choices. Most Americans have rejected these choices, saying they're the most disliked and untrusted ever. So what's wrong with this picture, is that there are other candidates out there that the public should be informed about, not warned against and intimidated against exploring and supporting.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to pitch to an independent voter to persuade them to vote for you over Governor Gary Johnson, what would you say to them?
We're both outside of the current system, but I'm the only candidate that doesn't take money from corporations, from lobbyists, and doesn't have a super PAC. So I'm the one candidate that actually has the liberty to provide people what they are clamoring for. We need an emergency jobs program. We need decent wages starting at 15 an hour. We need a Department of Environmental Protection, which Gary Johnson would abolish, because climate change is real, and we're not going to get there by simply turning corporations loose to do whatever they want to continue their pillage of the planet. We're the only campaign that's calling for a bailout for a generation that is held hostage by unpayable student loan debt. So I think there's every reason, unless you are a big CEO that's trying to get government out of the way so you can just pillage to your heart's content, I think our campaign is the one that everyday Americans are looking for. And furthermore, I'd say Gary Johnson needs to debate. He's been refusing to debate me ever since I was voted the winner in a debate in 2012 with him. He's refused to acknowledge that my campaign exists or even to argue for open debates. He's arguing for letting him into the debate, but not for having debates that actually inform and empower the American voter to make their decisions. There are 4 candidates on the ballot in just about every state. Americans have not only a right to vote, but a right to know who we can vote for.
So you have been confirmed to be on the ballot in all 50 states?
Just about. So it's 48 if you include 3 states where we're on officially as a write-in. So voters can actually vote for us, cast a vote for the future that they deserve, rather than the past, which has been throwing them under the bus. Voters actually have us as a choice in 48 states. So it's at least 95, maybe 98% of voters.
Great. Going off of a point you made earlier about foreign occupation wars, President Obama recently approved a $38 billion military aid budget for Israel. But he also went on to criticize Israel in a speech given to the UN, saying they cannot occupy Palestine forever. What is your take on the Israeli occupation?
It is a violation of international law to occupy, to do home demolitions, to exercise collective punishment, to use disproportional force, and there's no doubt there are violations on all sides, but the violations by the Israeli military, that is violations of human rights, violations by the Israeli military are so massively out of proportion to what the Palestinians are doing that violates international law as well. So what we're saying is that as the United States, we need to turn over a new leaf ourselves and to say to our partners that it's time to abide by international law and human rights, and for us to put our money where our mouth is. Because if we're not, we've been saying this for quite some time. Throughout much of his administration, Obama has, has stood against to various degrees occupation by the Israelis. But we haven't been willing to do anything about it. So we're saying we're no longer going to be in the business of funding $8 million a day for the Israeli military while they are violating international law and human rights. And we don't limit this to just the Israelis. We say the same thing to the Saudis, that it's time to stop providing arms to a country which is massively violating human rights and international law, committing war crimes in Yemen, which we're actually assisting on in the conduct of that war and the intelligence and targeting and so on. But these are our weapons that are being used. So it's time for us to stop being the weapons profiteer really all over the Middle East and in fact all over the world. We need a policy, a foreign policy that's not driven by the weapons industry, but is actually driven by international law and human rights. That's how we're going to get to a future which is secure for all of us.
Yeah, so take the money for these occupations, put it back in our own pockets.
Yes, exactly. The occupations and to stop selling the weapons to any country that will buy them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So some potential voters might be turned off by rumors that you are anti-vaccination. However, in a Reddit AMA session, you elaborated that your concerns were more so about corporate influence in the vaccine approval process. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on this point.
Sure. So let's be clear. I'm a medical doctor.
Yeah.
I practiced medicine for many years, including at a college where I too required people consistent with public health standards, required people to have their vaccines in order to be enrolled in the college to protect those people who are immune compromised and who would be put at risk if there was an outbreak of mumps or measles and so on. So yes, I have a track record for supporting vaccinations as a basic infrastructure of public health. However, years back, I was part of the public health critique of the mercury in vaccines to say that, hello, we need to follow science here and not just the influence of the industry. We need to be sure that all of our medications are upholding the highest standards. In order to do that, you want to be sure that the pharmaceutical industry is not in the business of running or influencing any of our regulatory agencies. And it's not just the pharmaceutical industry. It's all sorts of industries that have their hand in through the revolving door and also through campaign contributions. And a more recent example of this in the FDA is the drug Vioxx, the pharmaceutical Vioxx, where there was evidence for many years that Vioxx was causing cases of serious heart disease, and the FDA sat on those studies, did not allow them to be released, even though the committee that was studying Vioxx was screaming that the public and physicians needed to be informed that there were very dangerous impacts that were causing serious heart disease. Over 140,000 cases developed while the FDA was sitting on this information because of the power of the industry. So that's what we draw attention to. And I think this anti-vax mythology, was an effort to divert from, what's been my criticism and point here all along, that we need institutions that the American people can trust.
And another point you've made recently is that children should not be subjected to staring at screens and Wi-Fi signals. I'm just wondering, given the fact that...
That's not correct.
Oh, it's not?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, what I said was that there are countries who've decided it's not safe. There is a science out there. So I am not taking a position on this because I'm not following that science. I'm just saying these are questions that are being raised that deserve to be answered. Okay. So what's done in many European countries, in Israel, for example, and others, is that they don't allow Wi-Fi to be used in classrooms for kids under the age of whatever. I don't know if it's 6 or 7. But, they take steps to protect the developing brain from what they consider a not insignificant risk. So, I do think it's important for us to answer that question as well. The NIH did a recent study, the most, what's thought to be the most rigorous study so far in animals, that raised very serious questions. And that should be followed up on. We shouldn't abandon the science because there's profit to be made here. Profits should not be the main concern of our regulatory agencies. They need to be protecting our health, and they need to follow the science where it takes us. And then, and then we make decisions at that time, which are always balancing trade-offs. Because it's a trade-off thing, it's never black and white. Well, sometimes it is, but it's rarely black and white. That's why we need agencies which are not, which are not influenced by the industries they're supposed to be regulating through the revolving door or through campaign contributions that then influence appointments that head those agencies. We need to get the money out of our politics so we can get the people back in.
So, changing the subject a little bit, I wanted to touch on this. Your campaign has been highly supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, given all these recent incidents, you probably know about it, sparking all this protest and violence. What is your take on both the police killings of innocent civilians and the behavior of the Black Lives Matter movement itself?
So, and let me just say now that it's being questioned that there was civilian on civilian violence. There's now questions as to whether that was a rubber bullet or a tear gas canister. I'm sorry, not a rubber bullet, a tear gas canister that was the source of injury for what was called civilian on civilian violence. So, we don't really know yet the full story. Like, we don't know yet the full story. The police came out saying that the gentleman in North Carolina, in Charlotte,
Terrence
Keith
Crutcher.
Scott. Actually, Terrence Crutcher was in Tulsa,
Okay,
and it's
yeah.
Keith Scott that was in North Carolina.
Right. It's
all
hard to
these,
keep up now.
It is very hard
Yeah.
to keep up. And what does that say? We're into like 700 deaths now at the hands of police, and there's hardly been a single case of police being actually held accountable with anything more than a slap of the wrist. Yet we know there are flagrant videotapes that show, like the previous Mr. Scott, who was in South Carolina, not North Carolina. Walter Scott was his name, who was captured on video being shot in the back as he was walking away, and then the police who shot him then coming over and planting a gun on him. He came over and dropped a gun.
I remember seeing that.
So there's evidence here. There's a lot of evidence of police not only murders, but then cover-ups, loads of it. Including the cover-up in Chicago by Mayor Rahm Emanuel by holding back the videotape about the murder of Laquan McDonald. So there's so much out there to be feeding, a real sense of fear on the part of African Americans. What we saw in the last week alone was a case of a man who was really shot in cold blood in Tulsa because his car broke down. His car broke down, he came to police attention, and then he was essentially murdered in broad daylight in cold blood. It's really staggering. And then the case in North Carolina, where it appears this gentleman was sitting in the car. There's no evidence that he had a gun. The police have now walked that back, and the video apparently does not show definitive evidence of a gun. And besides, it's not illegal to have a gun in your car. So their intrusion into his car, happened for no reason at all. Basically sitting in your car while black, waiting to pick your kid up at school, as this guy apparently had done every day for the past many years. So this is what we need to be fixing. If we fix that, I think the response of a very alarmed and worried public will go away. Let's address the underlying cause here. We don't need to be going into a state of lockdown or martial law, which just adds fuel to the fire here. We need to address the underlying racism and brutality and the militarization of our police. We need to ensure that there's accountability, because there has not been. Every community should have a police review board controlled by civilians, so that the community's in control of their police, not police in control of the community, which is what happens in these poor communities that get targeted. We also call for investigators who are independent at the that are available to every community, so that you're not having investigators who have close personal and cultural ties with the very police departments that they're trying to investigate. And we call for every case of death at the hands of police to have the right to an investigation. Every victim and every family has the right to know what happened and why.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for our interview
great.
tonight, today.
Real quickly, I would just say, I think one of the biggest issues out there is that there are 43 million young people who are locked into student loan debt, which is not payable. And I'm the only candidate that will cancel that debt. We bailed out the crooks on Wall Street. It's time to bail out the students. 43 million people is a winning plurality of the vote. So just by recognizing that millennials and Gen Xers are powerful, they tell you you're powerless, but it's exactly the opposite. You have the numbers to come out and take over this election, to render student debt null and void, to make public higher education free, and then to go on to create a Green New Deal, which is our next priority, that creates the right to a job, so that we have an emergency jobs program to fix the climate emergency, creating jobs in clean renewable energy, healthy local and sustainable food production, public transportation, and restoring our ecosystems. We can zero out fossil fuels by 2030 and make sure that we end the climate crisis once and for all, while we revive the economy and make the wars for oil obsolete. This pays for itself just in the savings in the military and from our health, because we get so much healthier by zeroing out fossil fuels by 2030. We get so much healthier so quickly that the health savings alone is enough to pay the cost of the green energy transition. So this is a win-win. There's no reason not to go there. We do in fact have solutions within arm's reach that will create an America and a world that works for all of us. It's all about rejecting the lesser evil, standing up and fighting for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do.
Yeah, I meant to actually bring this up earlier. How do you think people in our generation can get more involved in renewable energy and supporting it? Just some advice that maybe we can take to help for the future.
I think the most important thing is to get the fossil fuel influence peddlers out of the way, because there are so many solutions out there, so many programs, like, to be creating rooftop solar and to ensuring that homeowners can afford this, that there's an adequate payback, that the price is sort of guarantees a very quick payback, and that there are loan programs or subsidies to cover the startup costs. There are just a million programs that can make this happen. The limits are political. That's why, to my mind, it's not only stopping fossil fuels from blocking progress, but it's also stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, because if they're allowed to start those new fracking sites, which are devastating our water supplies, causing earthquakes, polluting the climate and
which
the
Hillary
air.
supports.
Well, Hillary, yes,
extent.
she does. She has refused to take a position against it. Same for the Democratic Party, for their voluntary platform. They wouldn't even pretend to take a position against fracking. And the head of Hillary's transition team is a major promoter of fracking. Ken Salazar is a big fracking booster. So yeah, Donald Trump, he's a climate denier and he supports coal. Hillary Clinton is a believer, but she supports fracking. And fracking is every bit as dangerous as coal. Coal is phasing itself out. Coal has become obsolete because it's no longer economically viable. But Hillary is supporting this dangerous new technology of fracking. She helped spread it all over the world, creating a department of fracking in the Secretary of State's office. So, I'd say watch what you, watch what you hear, because the talk is not the walk. It's very important to look at the track record, even Hillary's track record, around supporting poor children. Yeah, she supported the Children's Health Insurance Plan, but we need for parents to be healthy as well as kids if we're going to have healthy families. That's through a Medicare for All program, which Hillary, does not support and opposes and has worked against. Aid to families with dependent children, the basic welfare program that kept millions of kids out of poverty. Hillary helped and supported the destruction of that program, signed by Bill Clinton, and its substitute with a very poor replacement that has left millions of kids in poverty. So look at the walk, not the talk. Don't be intimidated into voting for more of the same. This election is too important. We're not only deciding what kind of a world we're going to have, but whether we're going to have a world or not going forward. Whether we're actually going to fix climate change or frack our way into oblivion. Whether we are going to stop these massive expanding wars where Hillary Clinton helped lead the charge. Yeah, Donald Trump says crazy things. Hillary, unfortunately, has the track record for
Already done
doing
that.
crazy things. We shouldn't have to choose between two lethal choices that actually the American public rejects as the most disliked and untrusted ever.
I agree.
So, what's wrong with the media, the corporate media, not the real media, like
Mhm.
those of you in this room here, but the corporate media that, takes the position of intimidating people into voting out of fear for the same parties, corporate-sponsored parties, that are throwing them under the bus. We have another choice. And actually, we have the numbers that it takes to win if only we're allowed to get the word out. That's why we are fighting to get into the debates.
Right.
And I urge everyone to come out to Hofstra University and stand up and stand together for the democracy we deserve. It's outrageous that the Commission on Presidential Debates, that's a private corporation run by the Democratic and Republican parties. It is outrageous that they are allowed to set the rules. The League of Women Voters called the Commission's debates a fraud being perpetrated on the American voter. We reject their standards as illegitimate, obstructive, and anti-democratic. We call for a common sense rule that allows any candidate who's on the ballot for enough voters that they could win to be included in the debates, because in America, we not only have a right to vote, we have a right to know who we can vote for. So voters can be informed and empowered to make the choices that are really critical, and we need to make them not out of fear. The election is not a question of who do we hate the most and who do we fear the most. Democracy needs a moral compass. We need to be able to bring our values to the table. And by the way, there's a voting reform here which any legislature could implement right now on an emergency basis that allows you to actually rank your choices. So you don't have to worry about this fear system. You get to rank your first choice number one, and if that candidate loses, your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. It's called ranked choice voting. The Democrats could solve this right now. My campaign helped file a bill, but way back in 2002 in Massachusetts when I was running for governor, so that there would be no splitting of the vote. The Democratic legislature, about 85% Democratic, refused to let it out of committee because they rely on fear in order to get your vote. Why do they rely on fear? Because they're not on your side, and they know they cannot win your vote. They cannot earn it. They have to intimidate you into voting for them. The fact that they will not support a common sense, urgently needed voting reform means that they're not on your side and they do not deserve your vote on that basis alone. We're the ones we've been waiting for. The corporate political parties are not going to solve it for us. So the clock is ticking on the climate, on the expanding wars, on nuclear weapons. This is time for us to stand up and use our power, the power that we actually have and the numbers that we have right now, to reclaim the future that we deserve, whether we get to the White House or we simply get stronger to be able to get to the White House next time. Whatever it is, it's a victory. We've got to start on the pathway towards our own survival if we are going to get out of this century alive, let alone the next couple decades.
So what can people do to support your cause and become knowledgeable about the Green Party's platform?
Great, thank you for asking. You can go to jill2016.com. You can also join the campaign there to open up the debates. And you'll find out more information about how to get there. We're starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, well before the debates start. And you can sign up to volunteer. You can get on our email list or go to our social media at Dr. Jill Stein, and that's Dr. no period, all one word, Dr. Jill Stein, and join the team. There's a lot of us here. Together we are absolutely unstoppable.
All right, well, it was great talking to you, Jill.
Likewise, Rob.
I will continue to be informed about your progress, and I really hope you make it through the debates.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Good talking with you.
Good talking to you too.